I think I've been in public garden field for maybe I don't know, say 45 years, and I have read about Olmsted work and thought highly of it. Just both his style and his philosophy, and then was able to get a job working at a place that was an Olmsted design, and so I felt very very lucky. And since then, I've read a lot about Olmsted, both his work as a designer, but also as a journalist and just a lover of beauty and places of peace. And that's I feel lucky to have been working at a place for 39 years that puts all that together. And the garden I work at is a Homestead Junior garden, but I think still in the same philosophy and design style as the Olmsted Senior. So I've worked here 39 years. I was here 20 years as director of horticulture and the last 19 years as president. Um, and when I came here, I was lucky to work under a director, Jonathan Shaw, who really appreciated history. He worked at the New England Wildflower Society's garden in the woods, and so he had an appreciation of native plants. And so we hit it off really well. And so I had a real interest in the history of the place. Uh, I'm a collector of all things historical. I have files and files. And then the Homestead Archives online became available, and that was later on. That was just recently, and I found out so much more about the gardens. And then just 2 years ago, we commissioned Heritage Landscapes to do a cultural landscape report, and that was a real eye opener. And it was almost like it had all these parts to a puzzle that just weren't fitting together, and then all of a sudden they came together. Um, and almost regrettably, uh, I have this cultural landscape report. Is sort of a roadmap of where we've been and where we need to go. On my retirement. But I feel like we've been able to accomplish a lot toward preservation, and I feel really happy to lay the groundwork for where we need to go for the next 5, 10, and 50 years. The gardens, when they were originally laid out, was 62 acres, and then over the course of the next 50 years, we had different purchases of land. Some of it was natural longleaf pine areas, still in sandhill uh, complement of plants. But then we also bought citrus groves. Um, Originally, when the garden was laid out and designed, there was a lot of open land around it, and this open land was put under protective covenant in 1920 by Mountain Lake, and the protective covenant was for it to be either pine lands or citrus uh, lands, agricultural lands. And so it was like that for nearly 100 years, and the covenants are still in place, but those covenants can be overturned by a majority vote of the landowners. There are a handful of landowners that could flip those covenants. Luckily, those covenants are still in place for another maybe 15 years. They're renewed every 20 years. So I would say for the last 30 years, maybe 30, probably 35 years, a big push of mine is, whether it was as a director of horticulture or as the president, has been to preserve land, to purchase land. And so over the years, when I came here, we had 125 acres. So it was about twice as big as the original Olmsted Garden. And now we manage or own about 760 acres. When you're in the garden looking out, you've got these beautiful vista views, and Olmsted was all about the views. And our views are probably the most important design element of the gardens. And so, I realized this early on, raised money through grants, through family foundations, and we've been able to preserve like I said, 760 acres. There's about in our area, there's another 1,000 acres that are still in need of preserving. So, the work is not done, but I feel it's integral to preserving the design intent of the gardens. Uh, I mean, our views are everything. If we lose these views, we lose the Olmsted design. So, it's really important. I have just an immense respect for Olmsted and the Olmsted brothers. I mean, they were the total package that they looked at nature, they looked at art, they looked at psychology, and they had a real feel for the land, the lay of the land. And it really is transformational to people who come and experience that. And I think when people come here, uh, there's a strong interest in ecology and nature, and also native plants attract native birds and native insects. Um, but there's a certain sense of place when you come here, and you get a sense that this place is part of Florida. It's actually, coming forth from Florida, not the artificial Florida, but natural Florida. So I think all of those things come together to create I'll call it a sacred place. People come to, and whenever we have uh, uh, trials and tribulations, whether it's the pandemic or the economy, it seems like we have more people coming here, and it's a place that people can retreat to, which is really neat because that's what Edward Bok envisioned back in 1928. He said that it was a place where people could come because Americans were becoming so electrified. And that's his words back in 1928, and we're still doing that today. I feel like this is a pretty special place, and I had a friend of mine, since passed away, David Murbach. He was a horticulturalist at Rockefeller Center, and uh, and he would come to Florida a good bit buying plants for their displays there. And I'd see him in the gardens, and I'd say, David, you didn't tell me you were coming here. And I'd see him, he would pop up almost once a year. And one time I said to him, why do you keep coming back here? And he said, well, this is one of my favorite gardens. And I said, well, why? And he said, because it's a whole garden. The whole garden is still here. And it really made me think, that that's something special. And there's this feeling, uh, so often, you have, Olmsted designs, and then over the years, people make improvements upon them, and they put this or that, and it becomes sort of a hodgepodge of collection of gardens. Um, and if you squint your eyes and you kind of close them a little bit, you can kind of still see that Olmsted design there. Um, and it's really hard to kind of understand the full impact of a design when you see it broken up. But here you still get that feeling, and things are still intact. It's not only the vistas that we are protecting, but we're protecting wildlife corridors, and wildlife was so important to this garden. Um, when I mentioned it's almost like you take off the original garden 62 acres, 32 acres was longleaf pine, and then another, I think it was about 17 acres were thickets. And so Olmsted planted just these thickets of plants. And so this was literally 50 to 70 foot wide thickets that was impenetrable, but it was planted for wildlife and birds. Just today, out on the areas where we're doing this restoration of the longleaf pine habitat, saw four gopher tortoises. And to think, these gopher tortoises lived to be, 80, 90 years old. They were probably around when some of them were around when Olmsted was doing his work. Yeah, I think probably the land preservation and the restoration has been really you know I'll say my legacy. A friend of mine had really loved the garden here, and she was a vice president at Disney, but she loved the garden here. And I asked her, I said, you know, we want to do something for children. What should we do for a children's garden? And she said, you should make the children's garden for children what the garden on the hill is for adults. And I said, well, we're a meditative garden. And she said, well, that's what you need to make for children, a meditative garden. And so it took me, I meditated on that for about 10 years. And, uh, and I realized that children learn through play, quiet play. And especially when children are immersed in nature. I spent a lot of times in the woods as a kid, uh, just looking at bugs and things that swim and climbing trees. But we decided to build a meditative garden for children. So we have a lot of art there, art of mosaics. I have some of my sculpture there. I did a sculpture of a gopher tortoise, um, and so I was really worried about that garden. We were about to open it. We spent about $3.5 million on it, and I had sleepless nights that kids would not understand. It was too subtle, and when we opened it, it was a resounding success, and kids really appreciate the art. And it turned out to be one of the most beautiful places that I like to go into. It doesn't feel like a children's garden, but there's things for children to do, and it's a freedom for children to explore, but all done with native plants and influenced by native design. Logs to climb on, rocks to climb on, uh, quiet places, places with water. So I felt like I did the garden justice. I didn't take and make a playground, but made some place where children could find some peace and quietness, but be enthralled. Um, and so I felt like I took what Bach had envisioned, and then took kind of an Olmsted approach to it, and married that very well. And it feels you don't feel like it's an appendage off the garden. And we didn't impact the original Olmsted design, but there is this sort of seamless flow between the two. So and my story of why I'm here and what I do was started when I was just a kid. I was probably 6 or 7 years old. We were living in Charleston, and I was exposed to Charleston Gardens and just history, and my parents would take me to Brook Green Gardens, which is north of Charleston by about 65 miles, and it's a sculpture garden, largest outdoor sculpture garden in the United States for a while, and looking at all these bronze sculptures and stone sculptures, and I said, I want to do sculpture one day and work in a garden like this, and so I've pursued that my entire life, and now I'm doing bronze sculpture. Um, and actually, I'm doing a commission for a children's garden in Fort Worth Botanic Garden, doing two sculptures for them. And I really have a love for creating sculpture that people interact with. And I just think that it's paying homage to nature too, to be able to make something that has dignity to it. So I'm looking forward to having more time doing that. Running a public garden takes a lot of work. There's lots of people, there's money, there's all the administrative things, and I'm looking forward to letting that go. I will miss this place, and I look forward to spending some contemplative time and just studying nature and doing more art.